Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. My guest today has just published his 21st book, and in a moment's time I'll talk to him about it. But that's not the only reason why he's a fascinating person. He's one of those rare breed of politicians who has a passion for words, who makes scintillating speeches, and women seem to swoon over him. And that raises the question, what is he like behind the vocabulary, the clipped English accent, and the hair that seems to fall over his forehead? Let's see if he reveals the answers as I introduce you to Shashi Tharoor. Shashi, let's start with your book, and here it is. It's called Tharoorsaurus. Now, I can understand the first part of that name, but why the second? Do you see yourself as a dinosaur?
No, actually, it's an amusing combination of Tharoor, thesaurus, and dinosaur. I think I gave credit to my friend Meru Gokhale, the publisher of Penguin, who came up with the term. And then somebody corrected me and pointed out that Amul, apparently in one of their advertising campaigns, had invented the term on a hoarding some years ago because of something I'd said. So the idea that combines my name with terrifying extinct species, the dinosaur, and a thesaurus, since people like to look up the words they're terrified by, as they might be by dinosaurs, all of that gives us a slightly jocular title.
Except for the fact that a brontosaurus wasn't terrifying at all. It was gigantic, it was slow, and it was said to be dim.
See, the thing is that I happen to be, if you like, the opposite of a brontosaurus, maybe a brontosaurus, literate, not so slow, fairly quick on the uptake and on the move. And at the same time, I don't really like terrifying anybody. So perhaps on that part, I borrow the Bronto.
For those who haven't got that wit, you're referring to Emily Bronte, the English author.
And Charlotte.
And Charlotte.
And Anne.
And both of them were sisters.
And there's the third one, Anne. Yeah.
Now this book is in fact a reflection of your fascination with words. So tell me, how did that fascination begin?
Began with my father, really, so it goes back to childhood. My father was a bit of a word nut. He was obsessed with word games like Scrabble and later Boggle when that was invented. But he also used to make up games for the family to play. So my sisters and I were constantly being tested as tots with a 9 or 10 letter word from which we were to derive words of at least 4 letters or more. My sisters, being younger, were allowed 3 letters. I had to do 4 or 5, etc. And they got tougher with time. Dad used to make up word games in the car. So, for example, on journeys, one of the things that he absolutely was brilliant at was he would ask one person to imagine a word of 5 letters. And the other passengers in the car had to guess that word by counter-guessing 5-letter words and being told how many letters match. So imagine that you thought of myths, for example, and the other people in the car said stick. Well, the S and the T match, so you would say 2. Then they would try stack, perhaps, and the A isn't there either, so you'd still get 2, and they'd realize that the vowels got eliminated in that process, and so on. And in 20 turns, you have to guess that original word the person has imagined. It's a lot more fun than I've just made it sound, and we grew up with that sort of thing. And at the same time, Dad was, he didn't do a lot of writing himself. He was on the advertising side of the media, worked as advertisement manager for the Statesman newspaper, their Bombay manager before that, and the advertising director of the Reader's Digest after that. So he'd had a media career, but he wrote the most wonderful letters, some of which fortunately have survived, and he wrote the most wonderful, very short columns in the newsletters of the Advertising Club. So the bug to value words, to understand that words represented not just joy in themselves, but also means of shaping ideas and communicating to others, that came to me from my father.
And I can see that the book is in fact dedicated to your father, Chandran Tharoor. Now, this is a compilation of 53 words, and as the preface suggests, these are meant to be difficult words, the sort of words that you would look up in a thesaurus to understand what they mean.
But not all difficult words, no. Some of them are, yes, difficult or obscure. Some of them popped up in the national conversation because I employed them in a tweet or something like that. Some of them are simply words we were hearing more of in our current space, like pandemic and quarantine.
But many of them are words that actually everyone knows, and that's why I wonder why they're there. Why have you got curfew, goon, lunacy, prepone, and troll? Everyone knows their meaning.
Because of the stories behind them. So, everyone knows what a curfew is, of course, but no one knows how the term came about, and that it was about covering a fire, couvre-feu. People on prepone, I wanted to tell a slightly wry story against myself, because, prepone only exists in Indian English. And I briefly thought that I had invented it, because I first put the word in print in an article in the Junior Statesman in 71 or 72. And then in subsequent years, I kept noticing it popping up in Indian publications and magazines over the years after I'd left India. And I said, hey, the word has survived and caught on. So I rashly wrote a column asking whether anyone knew of an earlier usage, because otherwise I was going to take credit for it.
And there was one.
I promptly got a letter from the lady who runs the Oxford English Dictionary, no less, from Oxford, telling me that not only had I not invented it, she had a citation going back to the very beginning of the 20th century in America, and one from the early 1950s from India. So clearly, nothing new under the sun when it comes to lexicography, but I was pleased nonetheless to tell these stories and also use that as an opportunity for a slight side riff on Indian English.
Now, my favorite of the 53 in this collection is Zwang. It's a chess term. It's hardly ever used these days, but why don't you explain to the audience what is a Zwang?
Zwang is the way the Germans would say. There's a sort of hidden T before the Z, but it's not there when you write out the letters. And what it is when you as a player of a chess game are compelled to make a move, because as you know, you can't pass in chess. If it's your turn, you have to play. And whatever move you play will result in your certain defeat. So in other words, it's something that obliges you to capitulate, to actually be complicit in your own collapse. And it's a wonderful term which I've, in describing it, applied to politics instead of to chess.
Absolutely. It's a word that's probably created to often describe the predicament politicians find themselves in.
Absolutely. I've given 2 or 3 examples of it in our country.
But you know, the interesting thing is that your vocabulary is rich, it's idiosyncratic, but occasionally it's got you misunderstood and even into trouble. Do you remember cattle class or squeamish vegetarian? Do you think those terms were just too Western for an Indian audience?
Well, actually, in the case of cattle class and squeamish vegetarian, they were both, I believe, maliciously twisted by people for political purposes. In the case of cattle class, for example, people deliberately overlooked the fact that I was responding to a question from a BJP supporting journalist who asked, when the austerity drive was proclaimed, Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class? So I used a term that he had employed and which I knew and had known for 30 years as a very mild and harmless term that did not say anything negative about people, but about the airlines for herding us into their coach class as cattle. Or
No,
like cattle.
let's be honest. Cattle class is a slightly pejorative, fun way of referring to economy class.
No, but economy class, why is it like cattle class? Because the airlines have reduced the space between seats so much that everyone is herded in like cattle. So it's actually an attack on the airlines, not on the passengers, to say it. So anyway, I replied yes in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows. And then I went off on a plane to Africa and was completely cut off from all communication for 23 hours.
And you had to start
when I
explaining
landed,
from
I
Kenya.
discovered the dung had hit the fan. So that became, the whole thing went, I can't believe it was page 1 news in India for 3 days before, and with people calling for my resignation for having demeaned economy class passengers and so on. And finally, it had to be deflated by no less a figure than Prime Minister Manmohan Singh telling a clutch of outraged journalists, for God's sake, it was only a joke. And that immediately took the air out of the balloon. But that's one thing. Squeamish vegetarian was a malicious mistranslation by a fellow I knew who was trying to worm his way into the confidence of the Communist Party in Kerala. And this chap deliberately misused squeamish to mean nauseous. I didn't say I found fish or the smell of fish nauseating. I just said I'm happy to seek the votes of and advocate the needs of and the well-being of the fisher folk in my constituency, even though I'm a squeamish vegetarian. And to turn that around into something that implied in Malayalam that I was actually considering, fisher folk to be nauseating was absolutely cynical and extreme, and it's a reflection of how cheap and low our politics have sunk.
But except that I suspect that this is one of the pitfalls of having a following on Twitter of 7 million. I imagine the only people who have a bigger following are Rahul Gandhi and Narendra Modi. Are you surprised by your popularity, or do you have an explanation for it?
No, I would simply say I just was an early adopter. I got into this part of social media way back in 2009. I think the same year that Narendra Modi did, but I was ahead of him till July 2013 when he overtook me, and now he's leaps and bounds ahead. And as for Rahul Gandhi, I actually tried to persuade him in 2009 to start on Twitter, and he was absolutely resistant. And you may remember when finally he reluctantly agreed to join some years later, it was actually with some distance from it as office of Rahul Gandhi. It's only when he became Rahul Gandhi himself that his popularity on social media took off, and I'm very pleased about it because it was actually a matter of some embarrassment for me that I had more followers than his office, as it were. But the moment it was him, he's gone well ahead.
Now, if the one striking thing about you is that you have a following of 7 million on Twitter, the other...
7.76, if you really must know.
7.76. You're very, very proud of it, aren't you?
No, there are lots of people who overtake me. Look, I was proud of it when I still remember back in 2009, I think the Hindustan Times or something ran a small little item saying Tharoor crosses 10,000 followers on Twitter. I was the first one in India, I think, to reach that landmark. And all sorts of people, and I won't even tell you how senior placed they were in our government, said to me, how do you do this? Any politician would give their ITs to address an audience of 10,000. So how have I got them and what can they do? And I was busy giving Twitter instructions to people. And then these controversies started. And all the ones who asked me backed off and said, we better stay away from Twitter. And you remember Venkaiah Naidu was then president of the BJP, rather sagely and as it turned out presciently declaring, too much tweeting will lead to quitting, which is what happened. Anyway.
But
so then it went on. I was the leading
Shashi,
Twitterer.
You give the longest answers to simple questions. I'm flabbergasted at you.
In India till about 1 million when Sachin Tendulkar overtook me, and thereafter I've been nowhere in the picture. But I say it only to point out that there's much less to be proud of now than when I was an early adopter and was the most followed person in Indian Twitter.
Now, if your 7.76 million following on Twitter is one reason why you're particularly striking, the other, and it hits everyone the moment they see and hear you, is your accent. But tell me, how did a Malayali who studied in St. Stephen's and then went off to America end up with a clipped British accent?
But this is the English we were taught, Karan. I mean,
Hang on a second. There are loads of Indians who are taught English and don't speak like you.
No, I'll tell you what happens is that I think those Indians who grow up as domestic expatriates. Okay, I was born in London, but we moved back to India when I was 2.5. So I didn't acquire my voice very much in English other than saying I want my mummy.
And your great foreign experience was in America where they have a twang. And yet you speak the most clipped English.
In places where the teachers spoke better in terms of the old British received pronunciation concept, a better version of what I'm speaking now. I just had a good year, and I'm proud to say I believe I have a reasonably good year when I pick up French or I pick up Hindi or whatever else. And at the same time, it also is true that because you're a domestic expatriate, no one mother tongue dominates. So my parents were Malayalam speakers. We were living in Bombay, and English became the lingua franca, not only within the house, but with friends, family, social circles, and so on. Then we moved to Calcutta.
But you're saying something fascinating. You're saying that this English accent is actually Indian acquired.
It's totally Indian acquired from Indian teachers. 1 or 2 Anglo-Indian teachers as well. But this is the way I was taught in Campion School, Bombay, in Montfort School, Yercaud, in St. Xavier's, Calcutta. And the fact is that there are many, many Stephanians I know who speak in sort of approximations of the same sort of voice.
But hang on a second. 30 years in America working for the United Nations and you didn't pick up a twang?
No, because I had already, I mean, you know, I think those who pick up an American accent in English in America are those who were never as fully at ease with English as some people of your and my generation, I might point out, had become growing up in India. So once you already have a language, if you lived in America for 20 years, I'm sure you wouldn't sound any different from the way you are now.
I lived in England for 25 years and I don't have your accent. And you acquired it in Delhi or Bombay.
Your accent is far, far
Tell me this.
worse than mine.
I know that you speak fluent English, you speak fluent French, you speak fluent Malayalam, and your Hindi is getting better with every single day. Which is the language you feel most comfortable in?
No, it's obviously English, simply because it was the language in which I thought and read and played and quarreled and wooed the ladies in my life and so on, all of that from...
and I'm very interested in that last bit, wooed the ladies in your life. Which language do you dream in, or does that depend upon who you're sleeping with?
Oh, you're terrible, man. No, I think that I have this blessing or curse that I almost never remember my dreams, let alone what language I may have heard.
You do remember who you've slept with, however.
Karan, behave yourself. No, but let me come back to the point. The mother of my children, who was my college sweetheart, and we married when I was 21, she is half Kashmiri and half Bengali. Now, inevitably, the only language in which she could communicate to her in-laws and I with mine was English. So English became de facto our language. Now, what was interesting was when the children were born, she had, as everyone with any smidgen of Bengali blood has, a desire to make good Bengalis out of them. So she started speaking them in Bengali until about the age of 2.5. That was the language that their mother spoke to them. We had a domestic helper who was Bengali, so that was the idea. But what's interesting is when the children realized, as they became more conscious, that the language the parents spoke to each other was English, it didn't take them very long to stop attempting to speak Bengali and even replying to comments in Bengali in English. And so in multilingual households, this can happen. Now, in their mother's case, Minu's case, what was interesting is the opposite happened. Her mother was Kashmiri with Hindi mother tongue, so the Kashmiri diaspora. Her father was Bengali. But what they did, perhaps much more wisely than we managed, was to only speak one language each to the child. So literally by the age she was 3 or 4, she found herself getting a message from her father in Bengali and going and telling her mother in Hindi, and as a result she's perfectly trilingual because she learned English in school. That could have been an ideal solution, but there are Indians who are like that, who are, I think many Indians I know, particularly educated Indians, are instinctively multilingual, and that's something to be proud of.
Tell me at this point about your childhood and about the sort of family you were born into. Let's go back into the story of Shashi and begin with what sort of family was it, or is it, and what was childhood like?
Well, my father and mother were both born in villages in Kerala. My father would not call himself a self-made man because he owes a big debt to his eldest brother, who was a good 17 years older than him and made his way in life and was a big success, was living in London, and then was able to bring his 3 youngest brothers over to give them a start in life. So Dad went from, I think, first or second year at Victoria College, Palakkad, where he was a classmate of people like T.N. Session of Election Commission renown, to London, finished his studies there and joined, started his working life in London, working as a representative for, I think his first job was the Amrita Bazar Patrika of Calcutta, amusingly enough, getting ads for them, for their publication in India and so on. After about 7 years in the UK, he decided to get back to Kerala and marry. And my mother, also fresh out of a village just a few kilometers away from his, came back with him, and that's where I emerged in London.
And so that's how you were born in London?
That's how I was born in London. And this is not betokening any great privilege. My father was very modestly employed in modest circumstances. But he never saw himself as an immigrant to England. I mean, he was in an England where there were very few Indians. In fact, he, as a student, helped found the India Club with Krishna Menon, who was the High Commissioner and had been the head of the India League. And that India Club, I'm very proud to say, has unveiled a little portrait of my father.
Come back to your own story.
Yeah.
Was it a comfortable, fairly well-off family?
I would not say that, no. I think my mother's family, in rural Indian terms, was better off. My father's family had grand antecedents, but had been in steady decline for a couple of 100 years and had not been in particularly good shape. My father's father died, my grandfather, I obviously never knew, died when my father was 10, and the family went through hard-scrabble times. In fact, my father recounts walking 8 kilometers a day to school, to high school, in a place called Alatur from his village, and very often having to do it barefoot.
But by the time Shashi was born, you weren't walking 8 kilometers to school at all, were you?
No, I was being pushed around in a tram to, I think, Battersea Park to feed and to feed the pigeons at Trafalgar Square.
And then when you came back to India, you went to schools like Campion School, which is quite a well-known school.
I came back to India, first went to a Montessori in Bombay. Then my 2 sisters arrived on the scene, and so my mother decided she couldn't cope with this difficult brat when she already had 2 smaller ones to take care of. So I was packed off to boarding school at Montfort in the hills above Salem, a place called the Montfort School in Yercaud, whose most famous alum, I think, is Roger Binney, the Test cricketer, and Ambumani Ramadas, the former health minister.
And now Shashi Tharoor.
But except that I wasn't an alum. I lasted 1 year, did extremely well in studies, but was miserable at everything else. And the reason was...
You were homesick?
Not just homesick, I was 2 years younger than my peers. I celebrated my 6th birthday in class 3, when all my classmates were turning 8. And so I was...
you were a bit of a prodigy.
Well, Yeah, well, I was good at taking exams, which doesn't really count for very much in the real
The
world.
Mozart of Kerala, except that he's not musical.
But apart from the fact that I was turning 6, I had also developed, when our family moved to India, I developed asthma, and a rather bad bronchial asthma in the days before inhalers and all of those conveniences. So I was very often confined to the infirmary.
So you
at
were a
school.
sickly child as well?
Oh, I was a terribly sickly child. So after having spent more time than the school administration thought was wise in the infirmary, but always emerging in time to ace the examinations, I passed out of class 3, but
So sickly, but brilliant.
academically all right is as far as I'm prepared to
Ace
go.
the examinations was your phrase. That doesn't sound like academically all right.
Well, okay, so I did well. I mean, look, I was just good at taking exams. It's one of these, it's a skill like any other, Karan. I mean, you're good at giving interviews. I was good at taking exams. What can I say? So I came
Come
first.
come back to your family. You have 2 younger sisters, and I noticed that all 3 of you have names beginning with S. Now, you were sickly, you were petted by your parents, you were probably adored by your mother because you were often ill. Did your sisters look upon you as a hated elder sibling?
Actually, I've been so blessed in my sisters because they have plenty of reasons, I think, to resent me. But on the contrary, they really did make me feel looked up to and adored and loved. And we have a wonderful
So
relationship
you're the
now.
adored elder brother.
I suppose so, yes. I mean, in some ways, I was also made to feel that the burden of expectations from the parents were all on my head because I was the eldest, and perhaps also because I was the boy. And there was much less pressure on them, which is why they've turned out to be such wonderfully well-adjusted people. Sensible, wise, calm, very
But
loving.
it sounds as if Shashi was the darling of the family, adored by his parents,
Oh,
petted by them because he was often sickly, looked up to by his sisters.
The darling of the family was always the youngest, and that is true in every family. You're the youngest, aren't you? So I know that that's the way you were spoiled. I mean, it's typical. Current families tend to look after and dote on their youngest ones. But you know, my kid sisters were adorable. They were beautiful. They were baby models. My Shobha, the first sister, was the first ever Amul baby. After they went through 762 photographs and chose hers. And then Smita, the youngest one, became the first ever color Amul baby. So you see, I come from a very distinguished family, far more distinguished than me. I've only appeared in Amul cartoons on their hoardings.
Tell me, you were barely 22 in 1978 when you got your first job. It was with the United Nations. What attracted you to the UN?
Well, you know, I was always fascinated by world affairs, and I have no idea why. Because you remember in those days, Indian newspapers were very flimsy. I think they were about, the average newspaper was 8 pages long, even the Statesman, the Times of India, and so on. And you were lucky to have half a page or 3/4 of a page of foreign news, and I would devour it. And because my father worked in the media, we would read 6 to 8 newspapers a day.
So it was natural and inevitable that the UN would attract Shashi.
So, well, actually, the Foreign Service was my first attraction. But I did very well in my school and college, and won a scholarship to go to a school that specialized in international
Fletcher
affairs,
School.
the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And being out there opened, if you like, a slightly wider horizon. And unfortunately, it coincided with the emergency, which was a moment of political maturation for me. And I thought it would not be appropriate to try and serve the government of India when a government could take away the civil liberties and freedoms of its people. And so instead of sitting the Foreign Service exams, I applied to the UN. It's one of these things. I've written about it in my book, India from Midnight to
You
the
spent
Millennium.
30 years in the UN.
Yeah.
How do you look
29.
back? How do you look back on that period?
Oh, with immense satisfaction. It really was. I was incredibly privileged. I realized that in a vast organization like the UN, you can easily end up as a lost cipher in the bureaucracy or somebody dealing with files and pushing papers. I was incredibly lucky. I had 11 and a half years with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees at a time when refugee crises were exploding around the world. And I still remember with wonderment how 5 of the first 6 stories in the BBC World Service would mention my organization, UNHCR, which when I joined it was completely unknown. It was a tiny organization. We all knew each other by our first names.
So for a 22-year-old, this was not just satisfying, it was thrilling.
It was thrilling. And the kinds of crises, I mean, I happened directly to head the office in Singapore during the Vietnamese boat people crisis at its peak, when I had thousands of people crowded into this tiny little camp that the Singaporeans had given us. And unlike the other Southeast Asian countries, the Singaporeans said to the UN, you run the bloody camp. We don't want these people here and we don't want to take any responsibility for them. And that was a huge challenge because I was the only UN official actually running a refugee camp. Everywhere else, the governments kept tight control over the refugee camps on their territory.
So
it was an amazing growing up experience. I became sort of the UN's expert on rescue at sea because those are the cases coming in to Singapore. I found myself coming up with creative solutions to problems I could never have been trained for or prepared for. I got the first refugees anywhere from the Solidarity crackdown in Poland arriving at my door. I had all sorts of experiences which I must say would make for a lot of stories, but would probably take more time for an impatient Karan Thapar.
But tell me this, would you look back on the UN years as the golden years of Shashi's life?
Oh, I hope not, because that would be very sad. Because, you know, if you haven't done anything more worthwhile than what you began doing in your 20s, then you haven't really spent the rest of your life.
So you definitely don't agree that school days are the best days of one's life?
No, the salad days, as Shakespeare would say. No, I think, frankly, that the salad is a good course to start with, but you want to head on eventually to your just desserts.
In 2006, if I've got the date right, you stood for election for Secretary Generalship of the UN.
Yeah, so I began with refugees, didn't finish by saying that. Then I worked in peacekeeping at the height of the peacekeeping efforts in the UN at the end of the Cold War. Then I worked in the Secretary General's office under one of the finest Secretaries General there's been, Kofi Annan. Then I became Under Secretary General of the largest department the UN had.
And then you decided to challenge Kofi.
No. Kofi was leaving after 2 terms, and I decided, with his blessing, to run for his job that he was vacating.
But let me,
I lost to Ban Ki-moon.
In fact, the interesting thing is that probably everyone in the world would have said you're going to lose, including the government that nominated you, the Indian government. Do you think, with hindsight, this was an error on your part? Should you have stood?
No, I certainly think I should have. First of all, I certainly personally, when I was asked, was taken aback. It was Dr. Manmohan Singh himself, no less, who asked me whether I'd be interested if India nominated.
So they approached you?
Oh yes, of course. It can't work otherwise.
It wasn't Shashi putting himself forward and asking the Indian government to support him?
No, you can't do that. You can only be a candidate if a member state of the UN nominates you. So the question wouldn't have arisen.
So what did you say when Dr. Manmohan Singh got in touch?
Well, I was taken aback, and I said I'd be very honoured if you want to do that. But of course, he and I talked for a while, and he said, what are the obstacles you see? And that's the most obvious obstacle, I thought, wrongly as it turned out, was China. I said, I don't think they'll be terribly comfortable, so we need to suss them out, and you might want to do that. And then the thing treaded water for a while, during which time the Korean candidates had tied up the American support, which was in many ways what ended up deciding the race.
But did you really think that you had a chance?
Oh, yes. First of all, because I had the most comprehensive experience for any candidate, and that's something that, you see, when Dr. Manmohan Singh approached me, I had already been approached by a dozen ambassadors of small countries, particularly small Asian countries. It was meant to be Asia's turn. They came for themselves as people who had worked with me at the UN and said, listen, why don't you put yourself forward? I said, you know, I can't put myself forward. My government has to do it. And I don't work for my government. And I've never worked for my government. I've always been an independent international civil servant. So I'm not sure this is a serious proposition. But the fact is that for a lot of people, somebody who'd done humanitarian work, political work, peacekeeping work, administration and budget and communications, and at the same time worked directly with a Secretary General and seen what his job is like.
So you were ideally suited.
I seem to have the ideal profile. But you know,
the problem was that the Americans had committed themselves to Ban Ki-moon.
But it's not just that. A job like this is ultimately not about the best resume. It is a political decision. And it's a political decision made by 15 member states.
Which is why I asked the question, was it a mistake to stand?
Well, had Dr. Manmohan Singh and the Indian government of the time been able to square the Americans earlier than they did, I think it could have made a big difference. Certainly, as far as the Chinese were concerned, to our pleasant surprise, they did not veto me at any stage. In fact, what's very interesting was I went at the suggestion of the Indians to see the Chinese on my own steam, that is at my own expense, neither going on a UN mission nor going on. I took leave and went for 2 days to Beijing, met the foreign minister. And it was quite a story because I remember calling the the Chinese ambassador and saying, listen, this is why I want to come. And if China finds it uncomfortable to receive me on this subject, I will fully understand, and that'll be the end of that. And the ambassador said, let me check with my capital. And a week later, he calls me back and says, they'd like to receive you. So I said, you do understand, I'm not coming on UN business, and I'm not coming as a representative of the Indian government. I'm coming as an individual. And he said, in that case, we'll send the car to the airport. And they did. And I was taken straight from the plane to see the foreign minister for what was intended to be a 20-minute appointment before I saw his subordinates. Instead, it turned out to be an hour and a half. And at the end of an extensive conversation in which he even tested me on my French, he was a Chinese foreign minister who knew some French, said at the end of it, you can convey to your government, China will not stand in your way. And that, he was as good as his word, because when I did contest eventually and the ballots came, China abstained, but not, in fact, the very first ballot they voted for me.
So you're saying something that's fascinating. If Dr. Manmohan Singh had been quicker to speak to the Americans and had actually done so before Ban Ki-moon and the South Koreans had got in touch, Shashi Tharoor could have been the Secretary General.
No, I could have been a contender at any rate, but in all fairness to Dr. Manmohan Singh, the timing was unfortunate. This was when India was deeply immersed in negotiating the Indo-US nuclear deal. And that was obviously a much bigger priority for the government than
But he also, as a result of the nuclear deal, had a relationship with George Bush that would have enabled him to bring this up as well.
That was 2 years later, Karan. This election was 2006. Our nuclear deal was consummated in 2008.
But the process had begun.
The process was on. And therefore,
in fact, the process began in 2005.
My surmise is, and I was never in the government, I've not seen the files, is that the government felt that it would be unwise to complicate a very important negotiation with the Americans by making a big deal of something else. So I know from the American side later, when it was all over, a number of friends very highly placed in the State Department and the White House gave me their version of events, and I fully.
Now, the UN's loss, in a sense, became India's gain, because in 2009 you joined the Congress Party, you got elected from Thiruvananthapuram. What drew you to a second career in politics?
Well, first of all, I did want a second career, because though Ban Ki-moon, the victor, was gracious enough to invite me to remain, I just felt it would be unseemly, having contested against him, to anything I said or did would presumably have cast a shadow either on me or on him, and I just thought it wasn't the right thing to do. So at the age of 51, having in the normal course been entitled to expect a somewhat lengthier career, I suddenly found myself having to look for something else. And for a year, I actually sort of did some consultancy work for a Dubai-based company that had interests in Kerala, and particularly in India, I mean in India generally, but particularly in Kerala. And that brought me to India a lot. And I sort of renewed my links with people. I mean, when I came to India, I would always make it a point to call on the people whom I had met in my UN days. So I used to regularly meet Jaswant Singh and Yashwant Sinha, the two foreign ministers of the BJP. I would regularly see Sonia Gandhi ji, who had seen me in New York, and I would see Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was always happy to see me.
So how did the invitation to join Congress happen?
It came from the Congress Party.
Sonia got in touch.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I was seeing them, particularly during this 1 year after I'd left the UN, a year and almost 2 years actually. I was seeing them reasonably, not every month or something, but certainly I would say at least half a dozen times. And it was the time, for example, when I was invited to deliver the 2007 Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Oration with Sonia Gandhi and the others in the chair and so on. So I came in as an outside speaker and delivered that speech, but obviously there were private conversations.
So when she approached you,
all of these things, I was not an unknown commodity.
But when she approached you, did you accept with alacrity, or did you need time to think about it? Were you keen to get into politics?
I accepted with alacrity, Karan. First of all, because my brief stint in the business world taught me that it just didn't motivate me. I'd never been motivated by money. I'd got into both the IIMs and gone off to Fletcher instead. I'm just not, business and the bottom line were not my things. I've always, for whatever reason, wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And that making a difference, I knew in any democracy was best done through politics. And I knew that the only reason I'd never dabbled in politics, despite a fascination for the subject, was because I had no political background, and I thought in India it was a closed circle.
Sonia's approach gave you that political opportunity.
It gave me an entree into the matter. Then both she and Dr. Manmohan Singh were incredibly supportive.
Tell me, do you enjoy the rough and tumble? I know you won 3 consecutive elections, and the biggest majority came in the third of those. Do you enjoy the rough and tumble of Indian politics?
The first and third were both almost equal majorities, but the challenge with the third one is the BJP had emerged in Thiruvananthapuram as the strongest of my rivals, whereas in my very first election, I was trying to wrest a seat the communists had won in the 2 previous elections. So my principal opponent was a communist, whereas by the time of the third election, the BJP was a formidable contender. So there's been an evolution in these 3 elections. I must say that I enjoy many aspects of political life, but some things one does because one has to, not because one relishes them, to use your word.
You know, the interesting thing is, for many people from the outside, you're probably one of the most successful Congress MPs. They see you, they hear you, they read you, they admire you. And yet,
and they troll me too, don't worry about it.
And yet, perhaps because you're smooth, suave, sophisticated, so good with words, and some would say so good with women, that your colleagues often look upon you and talk about you as a misfit in the party. How do you respond to that?
I've been called a misfit on the cover story of a magazine. I've been called a guest artist in the party. And I don't blame them, because, you know, politics in India has now largely become a lifelong profession. The vast majority of people in Indian politics have been doing nothing else since their college days, in some cases their school days. And I admire their dedication and commitment to that profession. And like any other profession where you suddenly see a mid-career entrant coming in, you tend to resent them. In my case, it was compounded by the fact that that career took place largely abroad. And so there's this sort of unfair perception that here's this man who's been living in the lap of luxury, now coming in and presuming to represent us. That, in fact, was the theme of the communist campaign against me.
The suaveness, the way with words, the image. That is not conventional for an Indian politician. Perhaps that's why they say he's not one of us.
Look, you'll have to ask them if they really say that.
No, I'm asking you, how do you feel when they say
it? Look, after about a dozen years now in the business, I think there's a much greater degree of acceptance than your question implies. In fact, when I was unwisely attacked by some of my colleagues just a few months ago and derided in various ways for the precise things you asked about, there was such an extraordinary backlash in Kerala, and not just in English, by the way, in Malayalam, from people talking about what I had done for my constituency, the way I'd related to people, and how the aspirational young people of Kerala wanted more politicians like me, and fewer whose biggest credential was that they'd done nothing else in their lives but politics. And I think that was a fairly sobering wake-up call to some of those who had attacked.
You're saying something very interesting. I'm picking up something from your answer. It's the aspirational aspect of the image of Shashi, right? The success, the suaveness, the smoothness that people respond to. In other words, you represent to people what they'd like one day or hope they could one day be.
I hope so, because I'm certainly, like every other middle-class Indian product, somebody who's had to make his own future and on his own abilities. I mean, everything I've done, nothing has been handed to me on a platter. I don't have any inheritance. I don't have any, other than the education my parents were wise enough to ensure I had. And everything else has come through dint of education and hard work. Harvard even, because the Fletcher School degree certificate carries the names of both Tufts University and Harvard University, since it was set up jointly by both. So I can point to Mr. Modi and say, look, I represent both hard work and Harvard. I've had a father who walked 8 kilometers to high school every day. He was a self-made man. I am obviously more advantaged because of the advantages he gave me, but I've built on those to achieve what I have, and I have brought up my children as well to work for themselves.
You know,
ultimately, so do most people, I think, in our country.
You began your answer about politics by saying that you always felt you wanted to do something to serve the people.
The problem to make a difference in people's lives.
The problem is you can really only do that when Congress comes to power, and at the moment, no one believes Congress is coming to power in a hurry. So I want to ask you this. Come 2024, would you want to continue to be a backbench MP, or might you look for a third career?
Oh, well, first, lots of things I need to disagree with. Number one, people may believe that Congress isn't coming back in a hurry, but that's partially because we have 3.5 years before the next general elections. So I will not suggest that Congress should be written off at all. I think it's very much on the rebound, and we've seen this literally in the last few weeks before you and I are speaking, which is for much of September.
But my question was actually about
October.
Would Shashi look for a third career?
And as far as being a backbench MP is concerned, strictly speaking, I'm a sort of mid-bench MP. I think I'm in the third or fourth row of Congress MPs.
You're quibbling, Shashi. Come to my question.
But the reason I'm quibbling with your question is, I think that only the most foolish politician declares long-term ambitions in advance. My ambition remains to serve the people. and particularly the people who elected me, namely the people of Thiruvananthapuram. I know I've been able to do that effectively while my party's been in opposition. In the years since 2014, a number of things I've done, things I've initiated have taken off and made a difference, and things I've done even despite not being in power have made a difference. And as a result, I know for a fact that I win votes of people who are not committed Congress supporters, as well as, of course, the committed Congress loyalists as well. And so I represent a certain judge me by my performance message, which I think by and large resonates well. Even at the beginning of this
So you're saying, and I'm
pandemic,
interrupting you, you're saying that
things.
in fact there is a lot more ahead of you that you want to achieve and you believe you can achieve as a politician. This is not the moment to say, time for a third career.
Absolutely. Look, it's not that I'm being unrealistic. I'm already a former minister. I fully realize one day I might be a former MP, but I still have no intention of ever being a former writer. I want to be able to continue impacting people's minds, if not their direct lives or livelihoods, through my writing and my ideas. And all those things I'll continue doing. Whether I do it as a politician or as an ex-politician, we'll have to see. For me, right now, there is a cause to be fought. I think the direction in which the country is going under the BJP government is dangerous.
Well, let's not get into politics.
We'll
this is not about politics.
We'll talk about that later.
Let's stick
but
to
I'm
you.
just saying, therefore, there is a job to be done.
Let's come to your authorship. There's a book that you published not so long ago that's done phenomenally well. It has a very catchy title, probably, I suspect, copied from Bertrand Russell, Why I Am a Hindu. But the answer is surely simple. You were born into a Hindu family.
Well, I begin with that on the first page, Karan. But then I go on to explain why that isn't enough of an answer. And the point is, in fact, the first paragraph says, the obvious answer, of course, is because I was born one. That's the exact sentence. But thereafter, what I talk about is the underpinnings of the Hindu faith that I have grown up with in India and sustained even while living outside India, but on regular visits here. What I've seen practiced by my own family and friends and relatives and families around me.
And the contrast between
and what has been most gratifying is the number of people who have come up to me, including people of very different political leanings from mine, saying, you have opened our eyes, this is the Hinduism that speaks to me. And I genuinely believe that the bigotry that is being propagated in the name of Hindutva is not the Hinduism of the majority of
Except that it wasn't the
Indians.
politics that I was talking about so much as trying to ask you, are you personally very religious?
See, it depends on how you define very religious. There are various forms in which you see you can
Do you
practice
pray
the Hindu
every
faith.
day?
I do pray every day, but I pray principally at home in my own puja room rather than being a frequent visitor.
There is always a puja room in Shashi's home.
I grew up with a home, and there was always, even whichever flat we lived in, we had a puja room, or at least a puja alcove.
Even in America.
And so in America, well, it was more either an alcove or a corner. One couldn't often afford to devote an entire room to it. But yes, I've always had the habit of daily prayer. But prayer more in terms of connecting one to a larger idea of the cosmos. I mean, I'm Hindu enough to know that essentially the divine is unknowable.
Do you believe in God?
Well, it depends again on what you mean by God. You've got to read my book, Karan, because the point is a personalized God who looks a particular way and so on is very much a later notion. It's the original Hindu concept is of the Nirguna Brahman.
The picture on your WhatsApp is a Ganesh statue.
Yes.
Is that aesthetic or is that a reflection of personal belief?
It's both. I've been very fond of Ganesh since my childhood, and I have a collection for about 100 Ganeshas. There's a picture of one of them. And Ganesh would, in Hindu terms, be considered my Ishta Devta. But the fact still is that I do pray. I have a very eclectic South Indian approach to the Godhead, and I pray to many of the principal manifestations, and not only to Ganesh, and not only to Krishna, not only to Ram, and not only to Shiv, and not only
This
to
sounds
Vishnu.
like an insurance policy in case you missed out the
Precisely.
right
It's sort
God.
of Pascal's wager, exactly. I mean, the fact is that when you think about these things, because Hinduism is one of the very few faiths that accepts that there's more that we don't know about God and creation than we do. In fact, one of the very early verses in the Rig Veda.
It's also one of the few faiths, if not the only faith, that believes that there are multiple gods and you can believe in any one of them or all of them or none of them.
No, it doesn't believe in multiple gods. That's the other confusion.
It's actually what's called cathenotheistic.
It believes that because God is unknowable and because God cannot be reduced to either a face, a figure, a gender, a shape, whatever, that the individual worshipper should be free to worship God as he or she wishes. So if you want to imagine God as a stout figure with an elephant head, that's fine. If you want to imagine God as a 10-armed woman riding a tiger, that's fine too. And if you want to imagine God in any other way, including, for that matter, as a suffering man bleeding on a cross, that is also fine to the Hindu. What's interesting about Hinduism is it doesn't claim to have the answers. It doesn't claim to be the only true religion. There's a verse, the Nasadiya Sukta in the Rig Veda, which actually says, where does this world come from? Who created it? What's it for? Only he in the heaven knows, or maybe even he does not know. And that skepticism, that doubt, that questioning is above all what makes me
And
a
that's
Hindu.
also central to your
That's
approach
fundamental.
to your personal belief, not just...
It's fundamental to my personal belief, to my entire attitude to Hinduism. You see, you can
But then
practice
tell me
Hinduism
something.
through bhakti.
No, let's not get into
which is
Hinduism.
going to
This is not
temples
about
and so-
Hinduism.
No,
This
but
is
I'm
about
just
you.
saying,
No, no.
I'm not a big goer to temples, but I still consider myself somebody who thinks about these things, feels them, respects them, and therefore prays.
What did you then feel when last year, sitting in a temple in Kerala, there was a mishap that could have, luckily, it wasn't, but it could have been fatal? Did you suddenly feel, sitting in a temple, my God, the God I pray to is suddenly forgetting about me?
No, in fact, it was very interesting because, we actually complained to the police. There was something nobody has ever heard in hundreds of recorded years of this practice of a tulabharam collapsing on somebody. So there was certainly some concern.
Explain to those who don't understand
The
that term.
tulabharam is a huge iron scale on which a human being sits on one pan, and items, which can be sugar, can be bananas, coconuts, or for that matter, gold or
And
silver,
they were weighing you
are
when the
weighed
scale
against that
collapsed.
and donated to the temple. So I was being weighed against that and it collapsed. Now what's interesting is that, that if the blessed iron, the thing that holds up the scale on top, had collapsed 1/4 of a millimeter in one direction, it would have rendered me blind for life. It would have severed my optic nerve. 1/4 of a millimeter another direction, it would have damaged my brain and possibly been fatal. So in many ways,
God was with you.
God was with me. And when the BJP supporters typically tweeted saying, see, this proves that this man is cursed by God, they immediately got the backlash from people saying two things. Number one, that he had a miraculous escape. And number two, spilling blood in a temple to the Devi is actually the greatest tribute you can offer the god. So that kind of squelched that campaign against me. And I returned to the campaign trail after a couple of days and won him happily.
We're coming to the end of this interview. Many people who know Shashi, who see him, who hear him, who look at him, say to themselves, this is a man who's gone from success to success to success.
Oh, you know better than
But
that.
the truth is that there have been some pretty black, despairing, awful moments in your life. When your wife Sunanda died, the police accused you of abetment of suicide, and you still face that case today. How do you contend with this?
Oh, and it's worse because of all the allegations made by certain unprincipled politicians, news anchors, and others. I mean, if I were to open my timeline any day of the week now, 6 years later, there's still accusations that I'm a murderer, wife beater, and worse. So it's awful. And of course, I'm deeply hurt, Karan. The fact is that as a human being, I've prided myself on representing in my own life and conduct certain values and principles. I've stood, for example, against corporal punishment. I've stood against the death penalty. I have a certain humane attitude. I'm not judgmental about people. I've been the kind of liberal who says, let people be who they are and become what they want to become, because that's them and you are you. And don't judge them, don't harm them, and stand their way, provided they're not harming anybody else. And I brought my children up on those values. Everybody who knows me is just appalled that people could even think such things about me. But of course, in public life, the vast majority of people don't know you personally and are prepared to believe the worst things about you. And that is very, very deeply hurtful. And so, of course, one has not only to fight the case, which has dragged on interminably. I mean, the police, as you probably know, took several years to come up with this charge sheet, during which many, many hours were spent investigating all sorts of things, none of which have amounted to anything other than this, as I've said already on the record, preposterous charge, which certainly my lawyers believe that a responsible court will dismiss one day.
The problem is that
we are going through the process.
For weeks and months there was a time when this was a dominant story. It was in the front pages, it was on television, it was on social media. Did you at that moment feel there is a fate over here conspiring against me? Did you feel that perhaps I've done nothing wrong, but what on earth is going on?
Well, the worst moment was when my 80-year-old mother was reduced to tears when a woman in the elevator in the building she's living in made a comment about her son. and what had happened and so on. And I thought, I, somebody who always took pride in making my parents proud of me, and to think that my own mother would have to suffer this kind of pain and indignity was the worst, the absolute worst horror that any son would want to have to go through in respect of a parent. In some ways, I'm only glad my father wasn't alive to see all this, because it could have killed him. It's literally that awful. But at the same time, I've always believed that the truth will win out, that justice will be done if you just stand.
That faith has kept you going.
Absolutely. I mean, when you have a clear conscience, that helps. I mean, if I was trying to hide something, I'd be far more anxious and fraught and worried that anything I was hiding had to be found. I've been hiding nothing. I've been totally upfront. But in fact, the police themselves have admitted in court that they enjoyed my complete cooperation at every stage of the investigation. They've raided my home and confiscated my laptops and my phones and everything. I've given them, when they asked, for example, access to my email, I gave them the entire thing and the password, and they took my entire email. I mean, the fact is, I have nothing to hide, and I don't want anyone to even think that there is something that would be wrong. And yet, this case is there before us. It has dragged on far too long, over a couple of years in the courts now since the charge sheet was filed. Of course, the pandemic lockdown and so on has also added to the delays. But eventually, we look forward to having my name cleared, and then to be able to confront the false nonsense media accusations.
There's a very real sense in which the worst is now behind you.
Oh, I don't know if that's true.
The story doesn't dominate the way it did. It isn't part of media law, of television footage.
Oh, we're seeing a reprise of it before Riya Chakravarti. It's the same thing.
But when you look back, did you realize you had the inner resources and strength to handle this? Or did it surprise you?
That was, it wasn't the first nasty episode. I'd had another when I was obliged to resign from government, though I was cleared and came back 2 years later into governance, so that was a small consolation. But during that first time, I couldn't recognize the depictions of me in the media that I was seeing. And now this is the second. So if anything, this old superstition that something that happens once may happen 3 times means I've got to brace myself for some third disaster.
But you're a stronger person for the horrible experience.
Yes, one was always brought up with this value of grace under pressure. You don't show pressure, you don't crack up in front of the public, the stiff upper lips. That was the culture of the time that I was growing up. You swatted hard for your exams, but you breezed through them and made it look effortless. That was the way it was. And actually, in today's world, where people advertise how hard they work and how much of sweat and dust and soil they've got on their brows, my style is probably a little inaccurate, little archaic and out of tune with what people want. But the truth is, it was vindicated by something Kofi Annan told me years ago when he was under very vicious and unfair attack on the oil for food scandal, quote unquote. He said something that his father had told him in Ghana, a Ghanaian proverb, which I didn't understand when he said it to me. He said, "When the sharks bite you, do not bleed." And when I said, I don't understand it, if a shark bites you, of course you bleed. He said, think about it, the time will come one day you'll understand. And he was so right, because when the sharks bit me,
you didn't bleed.
I bled internally a lot.
But you didn't show it.
I didn't let that blood into the water, because that would give the sharks the satisfaction to go in for the kill.
And that's the question I'm asking. Was it difficult not to let that blood show? Did you realize you had the strength, the inner resources to be able to be bitten by sharks but not bleed in front of them?
Karan, you'll never realize you have that strength until you're put to that test. People can have bravado and false confidence, or may even genuinely be courageous in most situations. But it's the moment that you face that shark's teeth sinking into your heart in many ways, that's when you discover whether you can avoid the bleeding. I've really been through a lot. There were obviously moments I questioned, because I was very conscious that if I hadn't come into Indian politics, I wouldn't have attracted the enemies and the resentments and the jealousies and the hostility that I have, and I could have lived a blissful, comfortable and far better paid life in a less toxic political environment somewhere else. But no, I came back to India because I care. You know, I was born with an entitlement to a British passport that I've never exercised because I believe in India. I believe in the Indian idea. I believe in what India stands for in the world as the first major post-colonial adventure. I believe in Indian nationalism. I'm proud of my faith. I wear the Indian flag everywhere with great pride and conviction. And the truth of why I do this is because, to me, it's fundamental. It's fundamental as to what I'm doing on this planet, that I'm here as an Indian and I want to participate in this great adventure of making Indianness mean something to 1 billion people and more. And that's why I'm here. And it was therefore, to me, part of the Agni Pariksha one has to go through to come out of the other end, if not healed or pure, at least unscarred and ready to do the next right thing.
Trial by fire is how it was.
Oh, it's still going on.
Now, Shashi, there are 2 questions my female colleagues have asked me to ask you, and I've promised I will. The first is, can Shashi cook?
Can, yes, but I don't anymore. I grew up a typical Indian male, son in the household who only walked into the kitchen to ask when lunch would be ready or dinner would be ready. But I was thrust into cooking for myself in graduate school in America, where first of all, the fare in the college dorms was essentially, the graduate school dorm actually, was inedible for a vegetarian. All you had were the boiled carrots and peas on the side. Everything else was meat, or salad leaves, which I wasn't particularly fond of, though I've since acquired a fondness. So I actually had to force myself to learn to cook, and I was writing home to dad and mum for recipes and instructions and then executing them with varying degrees of incompetence. I then became very good at only 2 things, and those were both breakfast. One was I could make a superb scrambled egg from a cordon bleu chef's recipe, but with the Indian variations of onions, tomatoes, chilies, and so on, coriander leaves on top.
Sounds more like ande ki bhujia.
My sons still swear by that.
It sounds more like ande ki bhujia than scrambled eggs.
It's a cordon bleu quality bhujia, made by first boiling a little bit of milk in the pan, popping butter into it, and then breaking the eggs.
And you have to stir over a very, very low fire.
And the other thing that I've done, which was survival necessity after my divorce, was I used to make my own idlis in New York, and from scratch. I would soak the rice, soak the urad dal, mix them, grind them, ferment them, and in the climate of America it meant fermenting them for at least 36 hours. And then on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, I would steam them for hours, making an entire batch of about 88 idlis, shove them in the freezer, and then take out 3 or 4 a day for my breakfast. I'm an idli nut, as has now become again known because of a Twitter controversy over idlis, where a British professor has rightly described me as the world's most famous idli evangelist. But the truth is that I used to make them myself, and I'm still proud of that. Those are the only 2 things I can even pretend to be able to make.
The second question is, they say Shashi has been married 3 times. Is that the triumph of hope over experience?
Well, first of all, I think it's a failure. I mean, I'm the first to admit that when I got married, at a young and idealistic young age of 21, I never thought there would ever be a divorce in my life. And I still remember, within a year of my joining the UN, my then chief in the section at HCR that I was working in went through a divorce, and the enormous amount of pity and compassion I felt for him and his wife, that this had to be ripped asunder. And so I never expected to go through it myself. And having done it, I think I was unwise on the second occasion. The third, of course, ended in tragedy, with someone who...
But the second was an unwise decision.
Yes, because, it really was, unfortunately, a Western marriage with a person of very Western sensibility who didn't want to, quote unquote, live in the third world and so on. But the marriage took place at a time when I was in transition in terms of career, and in my mind, I had never relinquished the idea of coming back to India one day for good, if the right opportunity had arisen. And the right opportunity arose, I leapt at it, and we tried to make it work long distance, but it was not possible. She was living in New York, and I was in India, and so that was essentially a marriage that ended in less than 3 years. And I think that was there. But hope over experience is the old cliche. No one marries with an intention that you can end it one day. Everyone has that hope and that faith in a relationship. I'm romantic enough to believe in love and compassion and caring. I've seen good marriages, wonderful marriages, with great understanding between couples. I've seen an awful lot of bad marriages, and I've seen I've seen marriages in which, unfortunately, communication breaks down or the chemistry breaks down between the man and the woman, and they go on suffering each other. Which is better, which is worse? I think the Western answer tends to be, don't live a lie. It's better to divorce than to live in an unhappy marriage. The Indian answer probably is, listen, you've married for life. This is your fate. Get used to it, live with it, and make the best of it that you can. And I'm having gone through, if you like, the first approach. I'm not at all sure that there isn't a hell of a lot more to be said for the second. But of course, I'm
carry your cross to the end of the day.
Perhaps. I don't know.
Shashi Tharoor, at that point, let's leave it to the audience to decide which is right. Thank you very much for speaking so openly, so fully, so interestingly about yourself. Take care. Stay safe.